Greetings, my fellow real estate investors. On today's show, we have someone who's built a $100 million commercial real estate portfolio in Calgary, Alberta, but he's now since pivoted to microdosing. His name is Greg Habstritt, and this is the Truth About Real Estate Investing show for Canadians, and I hope you've had a wonderful summer. So before we get to Greg, judging by how slow the market's been, well, I know I can tell many of you took time off. I know many of my clients took time off to enjoy the weather, travel, summer hard as it's called. My name is Erwin Cito, owner of Iwan Real Estate, the 4-time Realtors of the Year to investors, and hosted this over-the-top successful podcast, one of the top in the space, ranked number 81 in all of business and iTunes across the world. But the good times still continue to roll for investors. It's not easy though. I'm an investor myself. These elevated rates, they certainly are a pain for everyone. But the long-term investor has still fared exceptionally well. I had this one client who retired earlier this year from her day job. So she wanted to take some profits off the table on her student rental property in Welland, Ontario to enjoy herself, travel, and strategically pay less tax via capital gains because she's no longer earning a job income. 10 years ago, we helped her buy a turnkey student rental directly from the builder. The house was designed with the future in mind, as it designed the basement to meet the building and fire code for a basement apartment, and that included the rough-ins for a future kitchen. There is no kitchen in the basement. Kitchens are, your classic fire hazard. It's where a lot of fires can originate. Hence, there was no kitchen in the basement. And also, just for at the time, basement apartments were not legal. But again, this was 10 years ago, and the city had all my clients. I have several clients who bought the same property. They all signed an affidavit prepared by the city that they would not create separation between the downstairs and upstairs by adding locking doors. 10 years later, these turnkey student rentals are still in high demand, as the location is just about 4 to 8 minutes from campus. The house is on the newer side and more modern and finished than its competition. Hence, our clients have always been successful renting them out. And even though we're currently in a tough market for tenanted properties are not selling so much these days. But because of property cash flows, our client was able to successfully sell this house for more than 2 times what she paid for it. So the return on average, assuming a 20% down payment, is it's good. It's 500%, or an average of 50% per year, straight average. The great thing about renting to students is that they graduate school and they move out, and then which allows us landlords to re-rent the house at market rates. And with I think the number is actually over 800,000. I think we've had about 800,000 new international students in Canada over the last 2 years. Rents have just skyrocketed near colleges and universities. My client, of course, is ecstatic to walk away with over $300,000 in profits in just 10 years. She's had a professional property manager as well, so the investment was as passive as it gets. If you follow the market as closely as I do, like I mentioned, tenant properties are not selling in this market right now unless they're priced the best. And then the more negative the cash flow in the property, or if the rents are low, from just like some of my properties, I've had tenants for 8-9 years, so those rents are low. Those properties are harder to sell. At the same time, so that's on the micro level. On the macro level, our economy shrank. Hopefully, you saw the news just last week that came out. Our economy shrank by 0.2% in the second quarter of this year. But at the same time, the expectation was to grow 1.5%. So we're not technically in a recession yet, but it's pretty much inevitable. Pretty much all the economists believe that we're going to be in a recession for Q3. I look around, I know people are feeling the pinch, spending is way down. The Conference Board of Canada released that Ontarians are spending like 8% less compared to last year. So many economists believe, including myself, the Bank of Canada is done raising rates. And last time the Bank of Canada paused in raising rates, that was in the early spring, and the buyers went gangbusters for at least 2 months. That before they did another cut. Sorry, before they did another increase. So maybe we see the same action this time, because the long-term economic fundamentals still scream housing shortage. Builders aren't building. Immigration still continues at a fast tilt. Colleges and universities need those international students to make budget. So I don't see how any of this changes, but we'll see. We'll see. Oh, and while the sales of rental properties have been slow, on the flip side, tenant showings, even in August when tenant showings are typically slow, tenant showings were in big demand, as vacant units were they would have about 10 or 20 something showings in a week or two, and rents continue to decline. So rents decline, yes, because who can blame housing providers, as all the operating costs and interest rates have gone up. Property taxes are going up, insurance is going up. Two of my properties, insurance just renewed with it, and my broker switched the provider. I don't think that's under their control, but under the new provider, each of those properties is $500 higher per year. Yeah, so that's close to 20% increase on my insurance. You better believe I'll be getting these requoted. If you have a great insurance person out there, please send them my way. In the end, it's the tenants that will suffer the worst from this honestly probably excessive immigration, inflation, and in general Canada's economic condition. This is one of my worst fears realized. Hence, I put my money where I thought it needed to go, which was to buy each of my kids a house, so that they would be able to afford to be able to get into the housing market when they were old enough. Of course, these conditions are really, really sad. Prices accelerated way faster than I ever would have expected, but that's the situation that we're in. But if you have kids or are worried about your own retirement, I think that's pretty much everyone, one or the other or both. I can't recommend enough owning a quality income property, probably a few more than that. And if you're interested in learning how my clients, like my client that just made 500% return in 10 years, how my clients do it, how my wife Cherry and I invest, then you'll want to join our monthly IWIN meeting. This one, they're online only. And on Tuesday, September 19th, my team and I will be there to share the latest in the market at both the high level and on the street level, including sale prices, renovation budgets, rents, and the best neighborhoods to invest in, which is actually where our clients are investing in. Plus, we'll have a special guest in Greybrook, and they happen to be one of the larger developers in Ontario. Cherry and I invest in their projects. I believe Cherry's invested our money in about 2 or 3 of their projects just this year. As past does not predict the future, but my returns have been exceptional and even better than passive. All we do is just transfer money and sign contracts. So if you want to learn how to invest like a developer, or at least understand how developers make money so that you can, evaluate your own development projects going forward, then you will want to be at this meeting. And then the following Saturday, on September 23rd, we will be hosting the IWIN Mastermind Tour in the Niagara region. And Niagara region, in my opinion, still has big upside thanks to the now recent correction where prices have come down significantly, plus new investment via the new hospital. And the government is not investor friendly yet. So you want to learn about how to invest in these areas before the floodgates open and all the investors rush in. So fingers crossed. One of my clients, one of my more successful clients, who's been a guest of the show, fingers crossed that we were able to see his triplex conversion. So if you're a real estate geek like me, our friend and client has converted a single family home into 3 units under one roof within the same building envelope. So no addition, no garden suite, anything like that. Now, that, in my opinion, is maximizing one's investment while tripling the housing on a single lot. I love it when our clients earn money, earn a world-class return, and are also part of the solution in creating more housing that Canadians desperately need. Make money, do social good. You really can't get better than that, in my opinion. Even the angry mortgage guy, Ron Butler, agrees. I've gotten many DMs, texts, comments on YouTube about everyone's appreciation for Ron telling it like it is. He was the guest of last week's episode. I do share many of his opinions. Some I don't. I'm just not nearly as vocal about it. I wonder if more people would prefer that it was, instead of often walking the line and being a bit more political and not trying to offend anyone. But yeah, I agree with many things Ron says. But yes, our governments have screwed this up royally at all levels. It's a sad state of affairs that buying a house as a rental property is a better investment than most businesses, right? I remember I went to business school. Businesses generate more economic benefit than a rental property does. So the way things are going right now, that's the sad state of affairs. But there's 2 more years until our next federal election. By then, our interest rates should be much lower than they are today. There will be past the recession, is my guess, and the lack of housing will still be a problem. I'm such a bummer. On to this week's show. As always, I look forward to bringing you a variety of guests to share their unique experiences and journeys. Today, we have an old friend, Greg Habstritt, back on the show to share what he's up to. After dominating the influencer scene, he's hosted conferences over multiple days with like massive speakers like the Dalai Lama. And he's owned a well, at the time it was worth $100 million of commercial real estate, largely in Calgary, Alberta. But that was a while ago, and he's since gone through dark times, both economically and personally. Yeah, he invested in Calgary, Alberta. Of course, you're going to go through dark times. To now, fast forward today, he's sharing about his current personal interest and finally aligning with his personal passion, which is curing mental health via medical psychedelics. Yeah, this topic is a little bit different than the usual. Note, Greg and I are not medical doctors, so none of this should be taken as medical advice. So please speak to your own health professional. Greg does share about his own out-of-body experience, flashing back to his childhood trauma, allowing him to understand his own current adult insecurities so he can actually address them. This episode is not for everyone. But again, understand Greg is really bright and he's made a lot of money before. So I always like to listen to these folks, what they're up to. We've had many hardcore real estate guests on the show. Greg, again, has been a guest on the show before. So if you want to hear more hardcore things around real estate investing, and when he spoke more about hosting a 3-day conference with folks like Brendan Burchard and the owner of Virgin, Richard Branson, like he's making millions of dollars as an influencer. You go back to the previous episode with Greg, or one of the other 300 episodes I've had with hardcore real estate investors in conversations. But if you're interested in being on the bleeding edge of where medicine's going, where we think medicine is going, or you want to better understand how you better understand yourself, how your own childhood trauma shaped who you are today. And again, this is going to likely be the next best thing after cannabis, then you will enjoy this episode. Again, Greg is a smart dude. His website is alightment.com. That's a play on the word alignment. Alightment, ALIGHTMENT.com. Please enjoy the show. Hi, Greg. What's keeping you busy these days?
What's keeping me busy? My family. We just got married in May, and so I've been with my wife now for 4 years. We got married out in Tofino, on the West Coast, Vancouver Island. It was spectacular. It was both of our second times around, so we kind of did it the way that we wanted to, as opposed to all the pressure of like what a wedding is supposed to look like. So it's a very small gathering. Like 22 or 24 people, family and just a bunch of really close friends. And it was fabulous. It was, if anybody that hasn't been in Tofino, it's a very magical place. And it was very meaningful because the officiant of our ceremony was a dear friend of mine, of ours. His name's Dr. Dan Engel. And he's the very first person that ever introduced me to the world of plant medicine and psychedelics, and he's become a really good friend of mine. So we had it was right on the beach, everybody in bare feet. It was sort of I would call it a bit of a modern hippie wedding. It was amazing. But it was nice to be in a space and like be grounded in what makes us happy and who we are, as opposed to trying to do it for the cameras and the video and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, yeah. So we've got my son Cooper's 15, and then we've got 2 daughters that are 8 and 5, Ella and Anna. And so it's summertime, it's busy, lots going on. And for me personally, like I would say that over the last several years, I've been going through what you could call an initiation, and just going through a lot of retrospective thoughts and building sort of the next stage for me. And so we can talk a little bit about that today.
How interesting, because as we were catching up before we were recording, like your wedding is almost kind of like your second wedding. Like how you said how you described it as being the way you wanted, much smaller than the original, than what the majority of people do on their first weddings and the current day weddings. It's kind of like an analogy for your career, right? Because when I think of Greg
Yeah,
Habstritt, I think of best-selling author. With your book about RSP investing, because everyone from my generation of investing knows has
right,
read your book or owns
right,
your book,
right.
and you hosted enormous conferences. You spoke on stage where there were hundreds and thousands of people in the audience, and like you're for the real estate space, like you were one of the biggest folks, especially among Canadians. Like even on the North
Yeah.
American stage, you were one of the most successful folks, were you not?
If you say so. I don't know. I mean, we had a big training business. I mean, if we go back, I don't know, 10 years, maybe a little bit more than that. I mean, I started in the mid 2000s, early 2000s. I sold my business that I had. I built up a business over my 20s and sold that in 2000, the year that I turned 30, and turned my attention to real estate. And that was in 2001, and just focused hard on real estate, acquiring the Alberta real estate market was pretty quiet back then. And then over the course of the next few years, 02, 03, that kind of thing, I started just acquiring tons of property. And people started asking me, "How are you doing this? Like, can you teach this?" And one of the things about me is when I go into something that I'm really a student of whatever I go into. So I go deep into the rabbit hole. I really try to understand it and learn it. And so I just started teaching friends and people that had heard about me, at little tiny, I'd get 20 people together and teach them about real estate, and started building a business around training. Got put on a couple of big stages in 2004 and 5.
Hmm.
And at the time, of course, Alberta was the economic tiger. And so I kind of got lucky with that I owned all this property, and the market absolutely just took off. I mean, I remember in 2006, the stat in Canada, or in Calgary, sorry, was the average sale price in Calgary increased in 2006 by 52%. So if you owned a house that was 200,000, the next year you owned a house that was worth 300,000. So you can imagine what that did to like balance sheets, and and rents were like basically effectively zero. Commercial rates, Calgary had the lowest commercial real estate vacancy in North America. Like office rates were 0%. You could not rent an office space in Calgary. And so, it was a rocket. And 07, 08 continued to drive. Of course, our training company expanded. We were doing, big events. The big event that we are sort of known for that I did was with Richard Branson, the Dalai Lama, Stephen Covey, Matt Mullenweg. I mean, the list goes on. It was interesting because that event in '09 was kind of the start for a lot of the big guys you see out there today. So, for example, Vishen from Mind Valley, if you're familiar with Vishen Lakhiani, that was one of Vishen's first talks, was on my stage. Or Brendan Burchard.
Yeah, Brendan. Yeah.
Nobody knew who Brendan was before that event, and then that sort of started him on his trajectory. And so I was working with a lot of really amazing people. And then, of course, 08, '09 happened. And at the time, we had a portfolio of about $100 million in real estate. And when something like 08, '09 comes, having a big portfolio is not anything to brag about it all of a sudden,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because it just turns into a headache management company. And so that's what happened. And so we got hit pretty hard. It was very painful. Had to divest of a bunch of properties, and like we were into raw land, and we were international, and expanded probably too quickly. And I think believed the PR of Alberta is going to be the greatest place ever forever. And in hindsight now, we know that's not the case. And but it's funny because like the conversations that you and I could have about Alberta today, you couldn't conceive those in 2007. That Alberta would basically be lagging most of the real estate market. So yeah, so we built a big company. We had to downsize that. divest some properties, but the training company was supported the operating of the real estate. So that's the one thing that I would say is, had it not been for my training company, we would have probably had a really big, it would have been a dumpster fire on the real estate side. I mean, it was hard enough, but the operating income from the training company actually supported the real estate. And I think that's where a lot of real estate investors get in trouble, is they start to believe their own PR. Their properties are cash flowing. You see it all the time that, equity, why would you leave equity in your property? It's just dead. It's just like, why would you leave that money there? Like, borrow it out and buy another one. And that all works when things are going well. But I mean, we're seeing another iteration. It's a different version and much less painful. But we're seeing yet another iteration right now in the market of what happens when you assume that a certain set of assumptions are going to remain true forever. And so for a lot of people, that obviously is interest rates, right? Anybody who just started in real estate in the last 10 years has come to believe that typical interest rates are 2 and 3%. And that's not how it works. And so what we're seeing right now, I mean, we're at 22-year highs now for the Bank of Canada rate. But that's only 22 years. I mean, that's not, that's not the entire history of money. And so it's been interesting to watch. And for me, I mean, the training company, one of the things that the flip side of the training company for me, the frustration was that I was coaching. I mean, I was coaching, hundreds of entrepreneurs and investors. And there was only a small portion of them that actually really took action and followed through and did what they needed to do. And it got, for me, frustrating to the point where I didn't feel right coaching someone and having them come back to me every 3 months and basically report back, and nothing had changed since the last time we talked. And I took that very personally, because I felt accountable for their outcomes, which, in some ways is not really healthy for a coach. I mean, I can only do so much, right? And so I just decided, this is a lot of stress. I'm dealing with a lot of things with the real estate. And so I shut the training company down, basically retired in 2013, because I wanted to get back into running real businesses. And so at the time I was winding that down, and I started a veterinary company, and decided that I wanted to get back in the service business, dealing with, like consumer clients. And so we started a veterinary company, a mobile veterinary company, and that went really well. We built that up over the course of 4 years and sold that in 2017.
Right. But veterinarian medicine was a personal interest of yours too.
Yeah, I loved animals. And so I saw it as the veterinary space. I saw it as an opportunity, because if I could apply my business acumen to my love of animals, I could sort of bring together my skill set with my passion. And that's what I did with the vet company. And the vet companies, or the vet industry, is challenging. It's been consolidated. I mean, there's one company, for example, that owns almost 2,000 veterinary clinics now in North America. The veterinary clinics in Calgary, more than half of them are owned by a single company. And so when that starts happening, innovation and creativity just sort of go out the door, because now it's a big corporate draw. And so we sold in 2017, and then 2018 I got separated. 12-year marriage. We got separated and divorced, and then I sold the business, of course. So I kind of went from having a very clear, solid sort of view of what my life looked like. I've got this, I'm married, and I've got this, and I've got this business, and I basically wiped all that away. And that was in 2018. And it was a scary time for me, because I just became untethered to, I didn't have an identity anymore. I didn't have a relationship. Wasn't really sure what I was going to do. And so that sort of, like, I would say, plunged me into a significant valley of introspection on my own life, and turning inward finally, because I had always had this sense that there were things that were driving me that were not healthy, but I couldn't ever put my finger on it. I wasn't really sure why. And so I started to do a lot of research into different things. So I started to pick up breath work, for example, meditation. I did transcendental meditation, which for me didn't click. I tried all these different things, and I mean, breath work, I really enjoyed that. I became certified as a breath work instructor and started doing more of these sort of internal processes. And one of the things that happened for me was I mentioned Dr. Dan before. I met Dan about 5 or 6 years ago now, and Dan is one of sort of the world's sort of leading authorities in the world of plant medicine and psychedelics. And for me, or when I had never touched magic mushrooms in my life. I've never done cocaine, and I never will. Never done heroin or any of that kind of stuff. I mean, I did some cannabis. I probably smoked cannabis maybe twice when I was in my teens or 20s. Hated it, and so I had always been counter or against drugs of any kind. And I was like I was a success story of the 80s war on drugs. If you've seen that commercial with, this is your brain and it's an egg, and this is your brain on drugs, and they crack the egg open. That sort of campaign turned an entire generation against, this idea that mind altering substances are just bad for you. They're going to rot your brain. They're going to make you kill yourself, whatever. And so Dan gave me a new perspective on that. And when I started doing the research, I realized that what we call psychedelics or plant medicine has tremendous potential for really two things. Number one, helping us understand and go back and first of all, identify and process and heal some of the things that upset us or that drive us, the traumas of our past. So that's kind of one thing, is it helps us heal and become more connected back to ourselves. And then the second side of plant medicine psychedelics is it's tremendously mind expanding in terms of creativity and innovation and ideas and things like that. And so I started.
Sorry, Greg, just to pause you there, because
yeah,
I want to rewind a little bit.
Sure.
Because I do want to expand on this as well. But before we get into kind of like the solution, like again, you've coached hundreds of successful entrepreneurs and real estate investors. Because I believe it was you that said like real estate investors are really just entrepreneurs in the real estate industry, right? You said that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what was driving them? And I don't have a better term for it. Was it right or wrong the way it's driven? Because you and I have exchanged some emails about this as well. Like I've had friends tell me I have a decent understanding of myself.
Yeah.
I've looked inside myself, understand like what largely what drives me, and any Asian or anyone with overbearing parents knows like we were conditioned to make our parents happy.
Right.
So I see that in a lot of myself. Like I actually see myself competing with my parents, both on the financial level and as a parent. Right. So I understand that about myself. That's part of what drives me. Maybe a lot of what drives me. So my question is,
that's not just an Asian thing, by the way. I mean, that's kind of maybe the stereotype, but that's not just an Asian thing. Like parents have an extraordinary impact on not just our upbringing and stuff, but the trajectory of our life, and in ways that most of us don't even realize. And like I would include myself in that category as well. And so, so to your point, one of the frustrations that I would have is, like I was saying before, is that like I would lay out for someone, here's what they need to do. They would go away and they would come back and they wouldn't get it done. And I couldn't understand why. And to be honest, at that time, I would say, if you asked me that question, I would have told you, well, they're just not committed enough. They're not serious enough. They don't have discipline. They don't have willpower. And if you think about it, like the ocean, right? Like it's all of these things at the very top that we explain as the reasons why we do or don't things.
Right.
It's like motivation, all of these superficial things. But what's going on deep beneath the surface, there's a force that's going on that largely we don't see, that pushes us. So think of an iceberg, right? I mean, iceberg is a great analogy. Like what you see poking out of the water, those are the things like discipline and writing a gratitude list and an action plan and affirmations and having a business plan, all these things that we focus on. But no matter how much willpower you have, or no matter how good your plan is, they're not going to move that iceberg. What's going to move the iceberg is all of that substance and material that's beneath the surface that very few people ever dive under to see what's going on. And so that's kind of how I would answer the question of like what was driving these entrepreneurs and me. And I'm using myself as kind of like the primary example here, but I wasn't really sure. I thought I knew, and like consciously, I thought I knew what it was. And you ask 100 entrepreneurs, and this would hold very true for real estate investors as well. Ask 100 entrepreneurs or real estate investors, what's your number one core value? Like, why do you really do all this stuff? What is it that gets you excited and that you're really trying to accomplish and achieve? What's the value you're after? And if I ask, listeners to think about that, what's the one thing that they stand for, they're all about? 98% of them are thinking right now of freedom. It's about freedom. And every time I did a talk, that's what they would always say is that's what they're really seeking. That's what they want. And one of the things that I came to learn was that as much as entrepreneurs consciously will tell you that freedom is what they're really after, what I started to realize both about coaching clients and especially about myself is that when I said that freedom was my number one value, that wasn't actually true. The reason that most people seek freedom is because they're actually seeking control. And by having freedom, that means nobody has control over you, right? If I have ultimate freedom, I get, you've heard it before, I get to do what I want, when I want, where I want, with who I want, whenever I want. That's trying to like cut the thread of control from you. And most of us as children, when we're growing up, control is one of the fundamental issues that we struggle with. And so if you look at and fast forward as somebody grows up into, an adult and they start a business, they tell themselves they're really after freedom. But what typically they're afraid of is they want control. They're afraid of giving up control because quite often they have trust issues. They have abandonment issues. They were taught as children that they can't rely on other people. So they have to only rely on themselves. And what happens is these lessons that we learn in childhood, first of all, most of us don't realize that's what's happening because our brain is such a powerful force at helping create blind spots for things that our ego doesn't want us to see because they're so unbearably painful. So an example would be, and this one of the things that I've said for many years is that most business problems that you have are just personal problems dressed up in a suit. They're really not business problems per se. They're struggles that you're having as an individual, but quite often you don't even see the struggle you're having because it's a subconscious issue. So as an example, let's say as a child, when you were growing up, you grew up in a very chaotic household. Like your parents weren't structured. You didn't know when dinner was going to be. You would come home and your parents weren't there. Or another night you might come home and there's 50 people in the house. And you were supposed to be going to hockey that night and your parents forgot to take you. And so chaos and unpredictability became the way that you learned the world. As you grow up, there's going to be a lot of manifestations of that chaos that show up in your life. And so one example might be there's a lot of people that continue to put themselves in financial pressure or challenges or stress or risk. And on the surface, it's because they're trying to like build a big empire and take risks and be this swashbuckling entrepreneur. But the truth is underneath is that that's the only place that they feel that they have control is when there's chaos all around them. And I know it sounds counterproductive, but these are the sort of challenges that I saw over and over and over. Or another one might be, for example, growing up, if you learned that you can't trust other people and that people are eventually going to abandon you and those kinds of things. Fast forward to, you're 35 years old running a business and you've got 6 employees and you go to your forum or you go to your mastermind. And what's the problem? Oh, my employees. I mean, I just can't, they're terrible. You can't find good people. People, they're not loyal and all these things. If you really look deeply at that challenge, typically the problem isn't the employees. It's that it's the employer or you have a struggle trusting other people, or you have this predetermined expectation that people are going to screw you. So you therefore are protecting yourself, and your relationships are all built on a kill or be killed mentality. So you can imagine how healthy a business, culture is going to be if that's the programming, that's the operating system that's running you. So these are the kind of things that I started to see, but I didn't have the context or the perspective to really understand what was causing it, and more importantly, how to fix it. And nowhere was this more true than in my own life. I mean, I had a lot of these same struggles myself. And so when I started down this path of sort of self-realization and really understanding what drove me, again, I used a bunch of different tools, breath work, cold plunge, things that would sort of bring me present.
Hmm.
And plant medicine and psychedelics became one of the tools, the technologies that I used. And when I
Sorry.
started doing,
Just want to
yeah,
elaborate where you are in this
yeah,
space, because we're talking about like 2018-ish around then. You were sharing in your
yeah,
journey.
yeah,
So you had a lot of life changes, marital changes. Just because I wanted to provide the listener more context, you sold the business, you sold the veterinarian business. Did you have
yeah.
anything else going on? Did you still have your part of your real estate portfolio? Like,
Oh, yeah. So I've owned real estate the entire time. I didn't sell it all off. It went from a nine-figure to an eight-figure portfolio. But I still have real estate and still do today. It's not a huge part of my day to day. I mean, I focus on, I've got a commercial office building, for example. So, when we're trying to deal with a tenant or whatever, that's a much bigger effort than typically for a residential, like for one of my houses, for example, and we're trying to rent out, a basement suite. Renting out 5,000 square feet of office space on a 5 or 10 year deal, $250,000, that's a much bigger focus point, but it comes in fits and starts. And so all along I've been doing that, but it's not a full-time thing. It's more of a part-time. I
right,
don't like to use the word passive, but like I don't focus on it every day.
right, right.
So at the time I sold the veterinary business. I was doing some consulting, business coaching for a couple of different companies. And then I really started into this path for myself and
Hmm.
created a ton of space, personally. So I didn't have a business that I was running. The real estate was there to, that was, providing income, things like that. But I just decided I want to get in touch with myself and what's really driving me, because I'm moving into the second half of my life,
Hmm.
and I want to do the second half differently than I did the first. And I want to be coming from an authentic place of
Right.
what drives me. And so that was in 2018, 19. And then for the next several years, I did a whole series of different experiments, I would
Right.
say,
And this
with
is like your
myself.
full-time gig now, is working on yourself.
It was, and again, I was doing some coaching, consulting. I got involved actually, because psychedelics and plant medicine became such a powerful force in my life, and I saw the healing possibilities and the power, the extraordinary abilities they could bring. I actually co-founded a psychedelic company in 2020, and that became sort of a full-time focus for the course of almost a year. And then I parted ways with my partners on that, and more recently with my wife. My wife is a trauma sensitive. She's certified trauma sensitive yoga instructor. And so she's opening a studio now in Calgary, and focused on women, particularly coaching women. And so we're opening a studio there, and I would say I'm looking at it's sort of like the second generation of coaching and consulting for me that I'm moving into, that I'm doing now, which is taking all of the business acumen experience, the stuff that I used to do in terms of coaching, but applying the knowledge of that underlying operating system so that I can help an entrepreneur or an investor actually pinpoint what's really going on beyond just the superficial story that they're telling themselves.
Hmm.
And so that's what I'm doing now, and with my wife, with the studio. Psychedelics and plant medicine are on the path to decriminalization and legalization. And what I see,
Sorry, Greg. Just before
yeah,
you get there, I think the trauma thing even needs to be worked out even more, because from my experience, kind of like what you're saying, like people, like I've masterminded for years, and again, those
Yeah.
conversations are still very tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
I see people who are just incredibly motivated by money and like scale and like building bigger, better, whatever. My 2 billion business needs to get to 10 million, and then once I'm at 10 million, I need to be at 30 million. Once I'm 30 million, I need to be 100 million.
Yeah.
I need all these clients and employees and whatnot. And again, like very tip of the iceberg stuff. But in my experience, for example, is with my forum. For listeners' benefit, I belong to a private organization of entrepreneurs. Minimum requirement is a million US in revenues. I get a lot of value, both in discussing business problems, but also a lot of introspection stuffs. And I actually derive a significant amount of value, more trying to unearth my underlying issues to understand myself and
Right.
what drives me.
Right.
That's why I think it's I see it myself, I see it in others. So I want to spend some more time on elaborating more on trauma, so that for the listeners' benefits, so they can look into their own lives to understand what better drives them, and if they're in alignment, like are they truly in alignment?
Yeah.
Like before we're recording, I even shared how there's a whole bunch of people out there who started investing. You could argue they were speculating, and
Hmm.
now they have assets, speculative assets, that are now infringing on their freedom. Wouldn't want that to wish that
Right.
on anyone. But I think where my point, or when I want to go, is I want people to better understand who they are, what they're doing, and if that's in line with who they really are. Like, for example,
Right.
before
Right.
when we were trading emails, I talked about like Dimitri Buterin, whose journey actually is similar to yours. When he exited his third business, it's when he went full time work on himself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know
Yeah.
Dimitri?
Dima's a very good friend of mine.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So your journeys
Um,
are very similar.
yeah. I mean, to be honest, I would say that, I mean, that's a huge compliment to me because Dima is such an extraordinary human being. He's very wise, obviously very successful. And I didn't, give birth to a child that, co-invented the cryptocurrency industry. But no, Dima's amazing, and yeah, he just decided that self-realization and
Mhm,
self-actualization was his life
mhm.
purpose, and so
And for
he
people not to
gets
wait until like I'm not sure his
right.
age, but I think he's closer high 40s or closer to 50 or something like that. But my point is that people shouldn't wait that long to do
If
self
yeah,
introspection.
if there was one thing that I could do, go back in time and talk to my 25 or 30-year-old self, it would be to go back and start this journey
Hmm.
back then, rather
Hmm.
than waiting until sort of a crisis of an existential crisis happened
Hmm.
where I was divorced and I sold my business, wasn't sure what I was doing next, and just felt completely lost in the world. And yeah, I think the trauma is it's really interesting because I mean, for me, growing up, and even I can remember being on stage, and I would tell stories of my childhood, and like kind of the backstory and the origin story and all that. And I would gloss over my childhood. And I would basically say, I had a fantastic childhood. My parents been married like they're high school sweethearts. Amazing parents, would give the shirt off their back. Nobody ever hit me. I was never abused. I had a great childhood. In fact, it was like, it was a pretty boring childhood because nothing really traumatic ever happened to me. And it's crazy because it was so boring that I don't even remember most of my childhood. And I remember thinking that, like, I normalized that was normal, that I couldn't remember my childhood because it was just, there was nothing to remember. And anybody that has gaps in their memory of, like, for example, I meet a lot of people now when we talk about this, and they'll say, yeah, I don't remember anything before I was about 10 years old, or I don't remember anything like in elementary school. I remember, like, when I was 4 and 5 years old, and then I don't remember anything in elementary school, and then junior high starts, and then I can remember them again. And people just write that off to, I guess there was nothing to remember. And really, what it is that what I've come to learn is that gaps in memory of experience of things like that, especially childhood, that's a classic marker of trauma. And so what's typically happening is if you go back in time and you look at what's going on, as a small child, something was going on that was causing you so much pain, that your ego or your protective self, I mean, ego is a terrible word that we get thrown around because we think of ego as conceit and like being better than other people, or arrogant. Ego really is a better way to explain it is protective self. You have this part of your psyche that is designed to keep you alive. It's that simple. That's your protective self. And your protective self, its job is to keep you away from the things that it's afraid are you're going that it could kill you, that you can't take. So when you're a small child and you go through an unbearable experience that as a small child is so painful, typically what happens is your protective self will essentially exile that memory and create a blind spot. So you can't even remember it consciously. And I know this from personal experience because when I started doing, I did a lot of therapy. I was going to, psychologists and things like that. And it was like, talk therapy, traditional. And it was, I would start to uncover a few little things here and there. But it wasn't until I actually started doing psychedelic assisted therapy where these huge awakenings or realizations came to be. And it's because your psyche is so brilliant at hiding them from you. Because at the time, you as a small child you don't know how to deal with the pain. It's so unbearable. And so, for example, if you're in a situation where you're 5 years old and your mother says something to you that makes you feel like they don't love you, well, they are basically they're God in your eyes in that moment, right? And if they don't love you, or that you internalize that as there's something wrong with you, right? It might just be that your mom was in a bad mood at the moment, and you were in a really vulnerable state, and you reached out for compassion and for a hug and for love, and your mom was on the phone, and she's just said, "Just shut up, just leave me alone for a minute. I'll be off in a minute." Just something as simple as that. That 4 or 5 year old child could internalize that to mean that they're not lovable because their mother doesn't love them. And that's all it would take. And then that can start the seed of a very, very difficult um, journey. I mean, I know it sounds crazy because the problem is most people think of trauma as these big, difficult, horrible things that happen to us, these overt things. So, for example, being abused or molested or witnessing a horrible violence or being in a war or those kinds of things, right? The loss of a parent when you're a child. And those are all, obviously very traumatic experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But I call those overt experiences or trauma experiences. But there's a second part because you can look at trauma in two ways. One is trauma is bad things that shouldn't happen to you. So those are the things we just talked about, right? Like rape and molestation and abuse and violence and all of these things, abandonment. But there's a second way to look at trauma, and that is trauma is also good things that didn't happen to you. So there was a void of things that needed to happen in order for you to have a healthy relationship with yourself or with your parents or with the outside world. And when those things don't happen, those traumas can be just as disastrous as being, raped or going through violence or the loss of a loved one when you're a child.
Right.
And that's
For
hard for people
example,
to
like Asian
understand.
parents don't hug their kids. That's a common thing.
See, but again, to put a point on it, Erwin, like you're laughing about it like it's no big deal, like it's a joke, right? It's a stereotype of Asian families. There's a lot of Asians that grow up that are debilitated by that very thing. And not to get too serious about it, but a lot of people laugh it away or joke about it because it's just, what's the big deal? I mean, my mom didn't hug me. Who cares, really? That the problem is that's the adult looking back and
Hmm.
using as an adult. Today, I have the ability to know that my mom didn't hug me. It's not because she didn't love me. It's just because
Hmm.
that was her upbringing.
Hmm.
We normalize it. We have excuses to
Hmm.
make for it when we're adults. But the problem is when you're a child, you don't understand any of that. And when you start peeling the layers back of these things that happen to us, and sometimes we're aware of them, and most of the time we're not, you start to realize the depth at which they cut and how embedded they really are. And so, I mean, I can remember, as an example, I did a journey with I've psychedelics and plant medicine is something that I've explored a lot, and I've actually become now like I'm certified as a psychedelic facilitator and transformation coach. And the reason is because I've gone through these experiences and I have unlocked so many parts of my life that explain why I was. So, for example, I can remember one of my experiences was I was doing it's called San Pedro or Wachuma, and it's mescaline. And I can remember going through the experience, and it was the first time that I realized that as a child, I never felt safe. And I couldn't even explain where that came from. But I got in contact with that emotion, which was in me, which was in my body. And that made me then start to ask questions. Well, why is that? I had another experience, one of my ayahuasca journeys, and I was taken back to, so this will maybe give you a good example of what I'm talking about. So when I was about 8 years old, a friend of mine, one of my best friends on the street, we were at his house in the basement and we were playing this game. And I mean, it's like the kind of stupid thing that you would see on TikTok now. And maybe they even do it, but we called it the pass out game. And all it was is basically hyperventilating. And so what you would do is one friend would stand in front of the friend standing in the front, and the other one would be behind them. They would start breathing in and out as fast as they could, as deep as they could. And then at one point they would breathe in and the friend behind would bear hug them from behind and hold on to them as hard as they could. And the friend in the front would pass out, right? It's hyperventilation. It's really not anything. But for kids, it's like this weird, and so somehow this game had like been passed from kid to kid to kid. And like even today, I talk to people that are like, "Oh yeah, I did that when I was little too. We call it this or that." Anyway, so this experience for me, I'm standing in my friend's basement, and I pass out. He lets me go. I fall forward because I'm literally passed out of my feet. I fall face forward, smash my face into the unfinished concrete floor in his basement. And I've always known this story because, of course, I ended up having to go through a whole series of dental appointments. And even today, I've got implants in the front, like two of my bottom teeth, because they broke out. They snapped off halfway up, so the roots were exposed. I mean, it was a tremendously painful thing for an 8-year-old to go through. And then going to orthodontics and all this stuff. Now, intellectually, I've always known that story. I've always known that I did this and broke my teeth and everything, but I've always intellectualized the experience. I've never really understood what it meant to me. So now, this is a few years ago, I'm in an ayahuasca experience, and I drink and I go in, the medicine sort of comes on, and I'm transported back. And if you've never done medicine, this maybe sounds a little bit crazy how it works, like with time travel and everything. But I'm literally like taken back to when I'm 8 years old, and I can see myself in my ayahuasca experience. I can see myself standing there with my friend on the ground, and I'm sort of up on the ceiling, like kind of a third eye watching this experience. And I watched myself as an 8-year-old pass out, fall forward, smash my face. I see my friend run upstairs because he goes to get his mother or his sister. I can't remember who was home. And I'm watching myself, and I'm feeling the feelings that I had as an 8-year-old, but in my sort of adult experience. And I watch myself wake up after, 30 seconds, and there's a big pool of blood around my head. And so I wake up, I've got blood dripping all off me. I look around, I'm disoriented. I'm in excruciating pain. It's an unfinished basement with like concrete floors. And those like burgundy posts that hold up the foundation in old, in basement suites.
Yeah, we have them here in
or
Ontario
in basements.
too.
Yeah. I mean, I look around and I don't know where I am. And it's this like dark, there's like a couple of windows with a little bit of light. and I'm all by myself, and I look around, and the pain that I experience is just unbelievable. And in that moment, I look around and I create two stories in my head as an 8-year-old. Number one is I I'm not safe in this world. I'm not safe. And the second one was I can't trust anybody because I look around and there's no one there to help me. And so when this experience sort of played through my third eye in ayahuasca, I came back out and it was like, oh my God, that's why. And then I could start to connect the dots of why all of these things in my life were true, and why I told certain stories to myself about the way the world was. And so trust became a huge issue for me in my life, trusting other people. And again, I would sort of then also connect that dot. And I'm not saying that everybody has this kind of experience that leads to being an entrepreneur and wanting freedom to be their number one value. But now it becomes obvious why I didn't want to have to rely on anybody else in my life. It's because I couldn't, because I didn't trust anybody. And I can't rely on anybody else. So you can imagine the impact if you're 8 years old, if that becomes your truth, and that became my truth in that moment, you can imagine how that informs all the decisions and the journey through the rest of your life. And so that happened to me, and I came out of it, and that took a lot of integration for me, because it was like everything that I believed about why I did things was untrue. And I always thought it was for the good things, because I want to, I want to build a big business, and I want to do this, and I want to do that, and I want to give back, and I want to do that. And, I realized that really wasn't what was driving me. And it was this fear. And I think at the end of the day, that's one of the mantras that I use all the time in my own mind when I'm talking to myself. The mantra is love, not fear. Because what I find, and again, we can apply this to almost every, category, especially when you look at government, politicians, things like that. But celebrities, it doesn't matter who you're looking at. But most of the world today and most decisions that people are making are coming from a place of fear and not love. In other words, they're afraid that they're going to be judged. They're afraid they're not going to have enough. They're afraid that they're irrelevant. They're afraid that they're not going to be seen as a success. And that sort of journey, and that journey was probably 4 years ago, that started to change the way that I saw the decisions that I made, to start becoming aware of, when am I coming out of fear as opposed to love? So am I doing this because I'm trying to impress somebody, or am I doing this because I'm actually terrified that that there's going to be some consequence if I don't? Or is it coming from a true sense of love for myself, love for the people in my life, and, love for the community at large? And so that's kind of, that's a really good sort of example of how these things happen in our lives, and we grow up and we have no idea how important or how impactful that experience might have been. And so what plant medicine and psychedelics tend to do, and there's tons of research.
Before we get there,
yeah.
Two questions, and they really are the same thing. Knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently? Or the question could be, what are you teaching Cooper about this? What are you teaching your 15-year-old son about this?
So two questions. So what would I have done specifically about what would I have done about that experience?
No, knowing what you know now, having gone through that 4 years ago, discovered that 4 years ago, how would that change your 25-year-old, your 30-year-old self?
I think for one thing, I would have uncovered, I hopefully would have uncovered that truth much earlier in my life. Like, for example, when you're 8 years old and you learn the lesson that, whatever lesson it could be that somebody learns, right?
Mm-hmm. I'd be mortified if that was my son. Like, that's what they thought the world was.
Well, let's see. And to put a point on that too, is that none of this was my parents' fault.
No, it wasn't.
Right. And so I don't blame my parents, but at the same time, most of us want to be allegiant and loyal to our parents. So we don't want to look at it and say, what did our parents do that contributed to where I am today? Right. That's a big sort of entanglement that people get in this work. But if I went back, like if you, let's say that like you're a woman and you watch your mother get separated and divorced, and then she starts dating a series of violent men.
They're terrible.
You could quite easily develop the truth that men are bad, right? Well, if you go through the rest of your life as a woman believing in your heart that men are bad, but you don't know that that's the story that you're telling yourself, you can imagine that, you know, how that's going to impact your life. But if that woman waits until they're 50 or 60 and then uncovers that truth, well, they can then start to change the path they take going forward. But if they would have done the work when they were 25 and were able to uncover and unwind some of these truths that they learned, well, imagine how much different their life would look. So I'm sort of answering the question that if I was 25 and I was doing this work, I probably would have uncovered a lot of these stories much earlier, which would have allowed me to make much more authentic decisions to who I truly am, as opposed to being driven in fear. So in terms of what I tell my son, Cooper, he's aware of everything that I do. He knows, like if I go to an ayahuasca ceremony, he knows where I'm going. We have very open conversations. I mean, Cooper and I have a very good relationship, I believe. And there's not much that he won't talk to me about. And we've had the conversation about, drugs and medicine and psychedelics and plant medicine and all that. And he knows that if he ever has any questions, he can come to me and I'll be honest with him. And I'm never going to prohibit anything. I'm never going to tell him, don't you do that? Because, you tell a teenager that, all that does is fuels their interest and curiosity in it. And my goal with him is to just try to educate him as he wants to be educated. I don't sit him down and like run lectures on plant medicine and psychedelics and stuff. But what I have taught him, I think the most important thing that I've taught him as a child growing up is how important it is to just be yourself. And it's going to be difficult to do that, especially as you get into your teen years, is to basically just walk your own path. Don't do it for other people. But that's what he does. And he struggles sometimes with that because sometimes friends turn away from him because he's not willing to cave into peer pressure and things like that. But I'm super proud of him for doing that. And, years ago, another vision that I had was kind of this parable of the difference between an owl and a fox. And I mean, we don't have time to go into it. I'll tell that to you another day. But really what it comes down to is we all have an inner owl. And the owl, like what question does the owl ask, right? And this is, I mean, it's a kid's story, but the owl is always asking, who? And so it's a way of thinking that your inner owl is always asking yourself, who are you going to be? Are you going to be yourself, or are you going to be accepted? Because that's the fundamental decision that children start to learn they have to make from very small in childhood, because they start having to deal with their parents as well. They want to be accepted, so they say things or do things they don't really feel like are who they are, but they do it to be accepted rather than to be themselves. And as a parent, the more that you can give your child the container and the space to be themselves, as opposed to doing the thing that gets them accepted, you're putting that child on a very healthy path as they grow up. Because in today's society, it's very difficult to be who you truly are and not worry about being accepted. And most of us go through 20, 30, 40, 50 years of life working to be accepted, only to come to a point where we realize, what the hell am I doing? And that's typically called a midlife crisis or an awakening or whatever you want to call it. And it's crazy because we spend 40 years going through our life, and then we spend the next 40 years trying to like unwind all the things we've been doing for the first 40 years. And so, that's what I would do, is go back to my 25-year-old self and try to instill the lessons in the work to be who you are, as opposed to doing it for external reasons. And that's kind of like one of the paradoxes of life, is that most of us are doing things the purpose for which is outside of us. You know, as much as we tell ourselves a story, oh, I'm doing this for me and it's really what I want, nobody's building a 30 or 50 or $100 million business for themselves. Like that's, I mean, that's just ridiculous. You don't need a $50 million business to be to be at peace with yourself. So anytime you're looking outside of yourself for something, that's in itself an indicator that's, that there's some work to be done there.
This is fascinating shit. I hope the listeners enjoying this as much as I am. So let's get into the medicine. Now, one thing I want folks to understand is that, like for example, I follow some Tim Ferriss stuff, and he's been talking about this stuff for a long time. But also but he always talked about microdosing, because there's a difference between abuse of substances and microdosing, probably a fraction of a small usage for actual medicinal purposes. Can you elaborate on that? Just again, so we can educate the audience.
Yeah. So very briefly. So first of all, you won't hear me talk about these as drugs. I will only refer them as medicine because that's just the language. That's my perspective of it. Really, the difference to me between drugs and medicine is intention. Intention is a very important part of anytime you start to go down this path, looking at whether it's microdosing or macrodosing, whether it's psychedelics or whatever it is, it's all about intention. And when you look back in the history, it goes back into the 50s and 60s of research going into using MDMA, LSD, magic mushrooms for therapeutic beneficial reasons. So for example, in the 50s in Saskatchewan, they were doing research on curing alcoholism using psychedelics in the 50s. And the 60s came, and everybody knows what the 60s was all about, right? Like free love and make love, not war. And it was all like it was the renaissance of the hippies. And psychedelics became a huge component of society. And the government at the time realized they were losing control of society because Nixon tried to send a whole bunch of young kids to Vietnam, and a lot of them basically said no. And they didn't like that. So that was one of the reasons that Nixon declared war on drugs. And it's been a horrific failed experiment. I mean, the war on drugs has created a massive incarceration problem disproportionately against minorities and Indigenous people. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. But the point is, they shut down all the research that was going on with these medicines. And only recently has the government started to open the door here and there with possibility. And there's now a ton of it's a boatload of research now that shows that these medicines, when they're used with proper intention, in the right container, and with the right integration after, that the results that they have for anxiety, PTSD, depression, pain management, even OCD, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, these medicines are having not just incrementally better results, but like multiples. So for example, one of the most recent studies, a PTSD study with MDMA that MAPS is working on right now, a clinical trial. Long story short, they did these were treatment-resistant PTSD victims. They basically tried everything else and they could not get away from PTSD. They, suicidal ideation, everything else. They went through the clinical trial, and a year later, 69% of them were cured. Now, they don't like using the word cured, but basically they had no markers for PTSD. 69% of them. A year later.
That's
now you look at the traditional
results.
treatments. The traditional treatments are going to be in the 10 to 20, 30% range, maybe. Meanwhile, a whole bunch of those people would have sadly committed suicide, but within a year later. So the point is, I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that this isn't just about taking drugs and feeling good and having fun, right? This is going to be, I think 10 years from now, we're going to look back, psychedelics are going to become one of the staples in the mental health fight to all of the conditions that we've got. The psychological world hasn't really changed in 40 or 50 years. And how many people do you know that are on SSRIs and antidepressants it really doesn't help for the most part. It might make life a little more manageable, but there's so many side effects. And we're seeing case after case now where somebody does psychedelics in the right context and setting, and they have one or two treatments and their depression is gone. And science is having a hard time explaining it. So, in terms of like psychedelics for the rest of us, um, psychedelics, the word itself is it comes from it was the name comes from what it means is manifesting the mind, and really what it means is starting to uncover what's unseen in your mind or in your psyche. So back to your question about psychedelics and microdosing and stuff like that. Microdosing, the theory is taking a very, very small dose, which is typically between 1/10 and 1/20th of what would be called a macro dose. So a macro dose would be like if you were to take mushrooms, for example. A macro dose means that you're taking enough that your vision is affected, your thoughts are like you perceive like things are different.
Yeah, you're high.
You're high, yeah.
Yeah.
That's how you're in an altered state. A microdose is taking a substantially like an infinitely small amount of that. So, like, let's say if you're taking 3 grams of mushrooms as a macro dose, then that would be 150 milligrams of for a microdose. And the idea of a microdose is that you shouldn't actually perceive that it's there. Like they call it subperceptual. But what they're finding is, and again, there's various studies on this, and there's some people are saying microdose is placebo. But I know personally, and from my experience, and a lot of people that I know, that microdosing certain medicines can help alleviate things like anxiety, depression, negative thoughts, sleep issues, things like that. So there's microdosing, and then there's macrodosing, and they're two very different sort of things. And you can do it with different kinds of medicines. Most people, like I think, that become curious about psychedelics, they start with microdosing because it's a lot more accessible. So, for example, when you're microdosing, you can drive a vehicle, you can go to work, you can do interviews, you can go on sales calls. Like nobody's going to really notice that because you're not high. It doesn't impair your judgment or your abilities. But what's interesting is during the day of it, you won't really notice anything. But the next day, this is where the power is. If you look back at the day before and you look at some of the interactions and things you did, you can start to realize that, wow, I ran into that neighbor of mine who I can't stand. They always drive me crazy. And somehow, like, they didn't bug me yesterday. That's really weird. And when you start to realize it, you notice that the microdosing is having an influence on you, but it's not a perceptual one. But what typically happens with the medicines is they make you more compassionate, they make you more aware, they make you more grounded. And so they have these positive implications. And again, it's different for everybody. Some people will try microdosing with, let's say, mushrooms, and they don't really feel anything. They don't notice any changes. And you can play with the dosage in that. The most common things to microdose are mushrooms and LSD. Some people microdose other things, like some people microdose ayahuasca or mescaline or other things as well. But mushrooms and LSD are the two most common ones. I know a lot of people, for example, that use LSD, and they'll use it in very small doses. There's studies now showing that if you use a small dose of LSD, and we're talking about maybe 20, 30, 40 micrograms, which is a very, very, very small amount of medicine, that it can really expand your creativity and innovation. So I'm working on a project right now with an associate of mine of offering a program to executives at high-level companies that's based on creativity innovation. And this is one of the tools that we're looking at utilizing, because what it does is it opens up the channels in your mind. It tends to break the patterns that you have, the way you think, and it connects new synapses in your mind. And neuroplasticity is a real thing, right? And they've shown that when you undertake, let's say, like a full journey of mushrooms, there's rewiring that actually happens inside your brain, and like different threads are now being connected that weren't otherwise connected. So you can see things differently. You can think of things differently. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I mean, this in itself could be a another conversation. But what I would say that the fundamental is psychedelics are becoming now mainstream. It's why you're reading about them all the time. It's why we're on the cusp of legalization in the U.S. We're expecting next year MDMA and MDMA and psilocybin are going to be decriminalized and legalized to the point that psychiatrists and psychologists will be able to start implementing them into therapy. And that's why we're seeing this massive wave, is because the science is saying and proving how powerful these things are.
Mm-hmm.
And so to bring it back to entrepreneurs and investors and things like that, the fact that entrepreneurs tend to have, my thesis, and again, this is something that I observed in a lot of my clients, my thesis is that entrepreneurs have a disproportionate amount of trauma in their past than the average person. And in part, for reasons we talked about before, that's why they became an entrepreneur. That's one of the reasons, is because they wanted to break away from feeling like they were under control or that they had to rely on other people. That's why people that become entrepreneurs typically get stuck. They can't get past that point of being the technician in their business. But they are more comforted by the fact that at least that way they're not relying on other people. And so for entrepreneurs and investors, if that's true, that there's trauma, there's things that are holding them back or that are causing them to make decisions that may not be the healthy decisions, that's why looking at understanding psychedelics and plant medicine as maybe a tool to consider can be a very, very powerful thought. And again, I also want to make it clear, I don't see psychedelics as a magic pill. Like, it's not like you take the pill, it fixes your problems and you move on. But what it does is it sort of pulls the veil back and allows you to see the stuff that you've never been able to consciously see before. And then the work starts. That's when you can decide, okay, well, I'm going to investigate this belief that I have, figure out where it came from, see if it's true, and maybe I can install a new thought or a new belief. And I mean, that's been the story of the last 5 years of my life, is doing these very things. And all I can tell you is that, I mean, a lot of people that know me from 5, 10 years ago, and I sit down with them, haven't seen them, and they're like, man, you're so different now. What happened? It's like, well, not really anything different. I'm just more of who I am now. That's how I feel.
Greg, I think that's a great place to leave it. We're over time. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. Now, I'm not a doctor. I don't know if you can, I always feel like I have to disclaimer everything, but I'm not a doctor. Yeah. This is not medical advice from me. Where can people learn more about this?
And I'll say I'm not a doctor either. I mean, I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of training and things like that. But at the end of the day, medical, and this is something, that I'll mention very briefly, like if somebody's on antidepressants or they have, a family history of psychosis and things, there's a lot of counterindications that mean you should not pursue this. But becoming educated is really the first start. So, I mean, if anybody's interested in learning more, I mean, I've got a couple of things. I wrote an overview of microdosing and like, what is it? Why would you do it? What are the benefits? What are the risks? That kind of thing. It's just a free download if somebody wants to learn about microdosing. And then I also wrote a PDF, and it's called Psychedelics for the Rest of Us. And this isn't for people that want to be journeying to Peru every 2 months and going on a 14-day dieta in the jungle, but it's for the people that were trying to live actualized, fun, healthy, productive lives. Is there a place for psychedelics in that world? And I believe for some people there are. So that's another a download. It's a little bit more generalized. It talks about psychedelics, a bit of the history, the different kinds of medicines, some of the risks and all that. But it's intended to be a primer of, is psychedelics something that I should start paying a little more attention to? And people can download that from my website. The website is, the name is alightment.com. So it's kind of the combination of alignment and light. And really what it comes down to is when you become aligned with who you truly are, that's when you can allow your brilliance to really shine from within. And so that's what my coaching consulting company does now. So it's called Alightment. So ALIGHTMENT.com. And you can start the journey there. There's resources there. And I'm going to be doing a podcast this fall, sort of on some of these topics because I get so many questions about it. So I'll get you on there, and then we can talk about your childhood.
Maybe I can do a microdose journey before I come on. And for my listeners' benefit, understand I think there's about at least 300 companies that are pursuing this, all in just Canada alone.
Yeah.
Just no one really talks about it, no one hears about it. But I have friends in the industry, and there's a ton of investment going into this. Just again, just because of the times, not a lot of people talking about it with the way the economy is. But yeah, there is a lot of
in 2020 and 21, there was an explosion of money that went into psychedelics, partly because people saw it as Cannabis 2.0, and if you missed Cannabis, this is your second chance. So it doesn't work out that way. So it's been a tough place for the capital markets for psychedelic companies. A lot of psychedelic companies have gone broke because they're having a harder time figuring out how are we going to monetize this thing. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because I don't really see, these medicines largely, especially if you look at like ayahuasca or mushrooms or peyote mescaline, these have been used by indigenous cultures for hundreds or thousands of years. And some of these companies are trying to figure out, well, how do we extract this molecule and that molecule to make a better molecule? And then we can patent it and sell it. I'm not sure that that's the right path for this space, for the medicine, because, my belief is we don't need to improve on the medicine. That's just a typical human Western civilization construct of how do we take something magical and make it better?
Yeah, and patent something you can patent and capitalize on.
Yeah. So, but yeah, and I was involved in that space because we founded a company and we got some financing from a public company, and so I went down that path and learned a lot about it. But yeah, I mean, anybody that's interested in hearing more about my story or whatever, or learning more about what we're talking about, microdosing, just go to the site and get on the list, and I'll send you sort of education every now and then. I don't sell a lot of stuff; that's not my thing anymore. So I just love talking about this because it's changed who I am. It's allowed me to live a lot more healthy, aligned, whole life, and I've watched it do the same for so many people that I love. And so I just love kind of spreading the message.
Enlightenment.com. Greg, thank you so much for doing this. I found this was
Thank you, Aaron.
I hope the listener enjoys.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to invest in real estate from scratch, my team teaches beginners how to use the #1 investment strategy that I personally use in a virtual free training class every month. Go to investortraining.ca/YouTube to register for our next class. The link's also in the description as well. I publish at least 2 to 3 videos a week here, so subscribe if you want to keep learning from seasoned investors like myself and my guests. And if you're just starting out, feel free to ask questions and comment below, and I do the best to answer each of those comments and questions myself. Again, if you're ready to learn the nitty-gritty about real estate investing from a professional investor, register for our next virtual class. That's at investortraining.ca/YouTube. Thanks again for watching. See you in the next video.